Heard you fell. Did you sign the papers to move the 500K yet? We need to lock that in. That was the first thing I saw when my phone lit up on the bathroom tile. Not my son's name on a call. Not "Are you okay, Mom?" Just that message glowing inches from my face while my cheek was pressed to cold ceramic and my hip burned so hard I could not tell where my body ended and the floor began. The steam from my shower was gone. The mirror had cleared. The light above me hummed. The toilet dripped. My legs would not answer when I told them to move. I dragged my fingers across the tile, hooked the phone closer, and forced my eyes to focus. Heard you fell. Then straight into the money. Did you sign the papers to move the 500K yet? We need to lock that in. No question mark, no pause, no how bad was it? The $500,000 that had taken 30 years of library work and one insurance check after my husband's heart gave out was in my son's mind, something that needed to be secured while I lay on a bathroom floor, unable to stand. My thumb shook as I hit call. It rang and rang. Voicemail. I tried again. Same thing. The effort made black dots float at the edges of my sight. Pain flared down my side with each shallow breath. I was 64 years old, alone in my small house in Columbus, Ohio, and my only child was too busy to answer, while his mother lay on cold tile. Another buzz. For a second, hope rose anyway. It was Kayla. We are in the middle of an open house. Text only. I pictured her polished smile as she walked some couple through a kitchen, talking about future value and equity, and how older parents should really be somewhere safe. I stared at text only until the words blurred. My hand cramped around the phone. On the recent calls list, Daniel's name sat on top. Under him, Kayla. And then, further down, Gloria. My neighbor. No shared blood, no right to a cent of my savings or an inch of my house. Just the woman who had shoveled my front steps after the last snow and brought over a pot of chicken soup when I caught the flu. My thumb slid down and tapped her name. She answered on the second ring. Mara. Her voice was rough with sleep and concern. What happened? I swallowed. I fell, I said, in the bathroom. I cannot get up. There was one heartbeat of silence while she took that in. Then I heard drawers' keys movement. Are you bleeding? Can you move anything? Barely. Are your kids on the way? I closed my eyes. No. Stay where you are, she said. I am coming right now. She hung up only when she reached my porch. I heard her calling my name as she used the spare key I had given her months ago, half joking about locking myself out. Her steps came fast down the hall. When she saw me, she did not ask about forms or accounts. She dropped to her knees so quickly her hair came loose from its clip. Your lips are blue, she murmured. How long have you been here? Too long, I thought. Not just this morning. I had been here for years in this place where I was more number than person. She wrapped a towel around my shoulders, slid her coat under my head, and called for an ambulance with a steady voice that made me feel for the first time that day like someone was actually in charge. In the back of the ambulance, with sirens humming faintly beyond the doors, a paramedic leaned over me with a clipboard. Emergency contact, he said. The answer came out of habit. Daniel Collins. My son. I gave his number from memory. He wrote it down. I stared at his pen, then heard myself add in a whisper, but he is busy. The man looked at me for a moment. Do you want us to call him? I saw the message again in my mind. Heard you fell. Did you sign the papers to move the 500K yet? We need to lock that in. No, I said. Not yet. At the hospital, they slid me under bright machines and explained in calm voices that I had a fracture high in my left hip. Painful, slow to heal, not the worst case. What none of their pictures showed was the heavier break inside me when I checked my phone and saw no missed calls, no new messages, just that same text about the money sitting there like a headline. They transferred me to a rehab center across town before the sun set. The place smelled like disinfectant and old vegetables. Gloria rode in the transport van with me, even though it meant she would be late to her shift at the nursing home. She kept her hand on my arm as if to pin me to this world. "You are not doing this alone," she said. In the small room they gave me, the nurse adjusted my blanket and asked with gentle curiosity, "Is your family coming tonight?" I looked at the ceiling at a small crack running through the plaster, then at the silent phone in my hand. "I do not know," I said. "I really do not know." 10 minutes later, the screen lit up. A video request, Kayla. I accepted. Her face filled the display, makeup, neat hair, smooth a car seat visible behind her shoulder. "Mara, you scared us," she said, but her eyes were on the road, not on me. "Since you scared us like that, we really need to finalize what happens with your 500,000 savings and the house, okay?" The words landed harder than the fall itself. Lying there in a thin gown, bruises forming under my skin, I finally saw my place in this toxic little system we had built. Not a mother who could have died on a bathroom floor. Not a widow who had held a family together for decades. I was a balance and a deed they wanted to manage before life proved fragile again. I ended the call without answering and let the phone rest on my chest. If this is what I am to them, I thought then maybe it is time to decide who I am to myself. By the time they asked me again about the 500,000, the final folder would already be waiting on my kitchen table. Thanksgiving of 2021 comes back to me in pieces, not because the evening was forgettable, but because it marked the first tiny crack that would later split wide open. And I remember stepping into Daniel and Kayla's spotless Columbus living room, where the smell of roasted turkey and sweet potatoes mixed with the faint scent of a candle that promised gratitude, yet felt strangely hollow. The table set perfectly with gold-trimmed plates and wine glasses that sparkled under the warm lights, and a handful of their friends and neighbors, chatting loudly as if this holiday belonged to them, not to the small circle of family I had tried so hard to preserve. After Tom died, and I took a seat near the end of the table where I could listen more than I spoke. Kayla moved through the room with the confidence of someone who liked being observed. She poured wine for the guests and laughed at comments I could barely hear, and when she finally sat, she clinked her glass against Daniel's with a proud grin that made me uneasy, even before she opened her mouth and changed something in me forever. Daniel's mom is old-school responsible. She announced her tone bright and careless, as if she were offering a compliment. She is sitting on what, almost $500,000 in savings, and at first I thought I misheard her because people do not usually discuss someone else's lifetime of work and sacrifice as if they were reading a price tag aloud. But no, she repeated it, and everyone around the table leaned back with the same impressed look people give a lottery number printed neatly on a ticket. One man laughed and said, "So you two already have your retirement plan," and I felt the heat rise up my neck. Although I forced a smile because I did not want to spoil the evening yet, inside a small piece of me curled inward as if trying to protect itself from a sudden cold wind. Daniel did not correct them, did not say that money is my safety and my future, not his project, not his inheritance to claim while I am still breathing. And instead, he shrugged with an embarrassed grin that only embarrassed me. And he added, "We are just trying to make sure her money does not go to waste." And the whole table erupted in laughter again, as if that line were harmless, as if the idea of my life savings being someone else's future asset was perfectly normal conversation over sweet potatoes and green beans. I looked around trying to hold on to something warm, but all I saw were people smiling at the joke that seemed to grow larger with each laugh, and I squeezed my napkin under the table until my fingers hurt. Kayla checked her watch and said in a half-joking tone that somehow cut deeper than if she had spoken directly, "We will give you a nice room and visit you every Sunday when the time comes." And there was a softness in her voice that had nothing to do with comfort. It was the softness of someone assigning a place for you, like redirecting furniture to a corner. No one noticed that my fork stopped midway. No one saw the way my throat tightened when Daniel chuckled and lifted his glass, as if the whole subject were harmless, as if I were not sitting right there, listening to the future they had carved out for me without my permission. I reminded myself that I had worked 3 decades as an elementary school librarian, that I had clipped coupons and skipped trips and picked up extra hours that after Tom died, unexpectedly, I put the insurance money away for emergencies I prayed would never arrive, and Daniel knew every bit of this because he used to help me organize the budget when he was young and earnest and kind. But the Daniel sitting at that table was not the boy who used to curl up on my lap with a picture book. He was a man who measured value in equity and gains, and Kayla was already calculating the interest on a future she believed would naturally include what I had saved. When dessert was brought out, the conversation turned to travel plans, home renovations, childcare costs, and I listened quietly, noticing that every time someone mentioned a large expense, Daniel and Kayla exchanged a glance that carried the weight of expectation, as if the math always circled back to me. Their friends teased them about being lucky to have a parent who managed money so well, and Kayla smiled proudly in a way that made my stomach twist, because none of that pride had anything to do with respect or gratitude. It was pride in projected ownership, pride in a future harvest she believed she had already secured. When I went to the kitchen to help clear dishes, Kayla followed and whispered something that might have sounded sweet to someone who did not know better. She said, "You worry too much, Mara. Everything will work out once you let go a little." And I stood at the sink with my hands in soapy water, wondering when exactly I had become a vessel, instead of a person, wondering when the love I poured into my family had shifted into entitlement. After I drove home that evening, the roads were quiet and the streetlights had halos around them from the cold. And when I stepped into my house, the silence wrapped around me like a coat that no longer fit, and I sat on the edge of my bed, thinking about the way Daniel had laughed, the way Kayla had spoken, the way their friends had reacted, as if my future had already been priced listed and scheduled. Something inside me tightened, something old and tired and almost too weary to speak, but it moved enough to make me reach for my laptop, and I changed my online banking password for the first time in years, the small action feeling like a shield I had never known I needed. I closed the laptop and lay down, listening to faint fireworks from some backyard celebration down the street, the small pops echoing in the cold air while I stared at the ceiling and replayed the evening again and again. And the words that settled in my chest were the ones I would not say aloud until much later. They laughed at the idea of my money, but no one spoke about my heart. No one asked what I wanted. No one saw me at all. And in that quiet moment, I realized that the first betrayal had already happened long before the fall, and I had missed it, because I wanted to believe my son still saw me as more than a balance waiting to be claimed. The first real drop came a few months after that Thanksgiving dinner, when winter had barely loosened its grip on Ohio, and my left knee started throbbing in a way that made even the short walk from my bedroom to the kitchen feel like crossing a field of stones. So I went to my doctor, who examined me gently and wrote a note that said, "Risk of fall," and recommended that I install grab bars and remove the loose rugs scattered through my hallway. And when I mentioned it offhand to Daniel, he immediately said he and Kayla would stop by to help me plan things out, which sounded kind enough until they arrived that Saturday morning, with the energy of people preparing for an open house, rather than checking on a mother who was simply growing older. Kayla stepped inside first with her iPad already in hand, and Daniel followed with the slow, evaluative look of someone scanning for potential upgrades. And before I could offer them tea, they were already moving from room to room, as if the house did not belong to me at all, commenting on the kitchen cabinets and the flooring and how newer appliances could bump an appraisal by $40,000, which she said in a tone that felt more like reporting market research than caring about my safety. And Daniel nodded while touching the counters like a buyer, deciding whether the place met his standards. They continued down the hallway, and Kayla mentioned how the neighborhood had been gaining attention and said if we listed next year, you would get at least $350,000, and she said it with a lightness that made it sound inevitable, as if she had already imagined the sale and moved on to calculating the next steps, and I found myself standing there in my own living room, feeling strangely like a guest. When we sat down at the table, Kayla opened her mortgage calculator app and began typing numbers quickly, while explaining to Daniel that if we rolled her $500,000 savings and the house proceeds into one, we could upgrade to that neighborhood near the lake, which has better schools and better resale potential. And I stared at her, trying to understand how someone could talk about another person's life savings and home with such ease, as if discussing the price of fruit at the store. And she kept going while Daniel leaned in to look at the numbers. I felt something in my chest fold in on itself again because they did not even try to hide it. They spoke as if the resources that kept me safe and independent were simply ingredients in a recipe they were perfecting for themselves. And Daniel turned to me with a tone I recognized from earlier conversations, the tone of someone who believes he is being reasonable while stepping over a boundary he cannot see, and said, "Mom, you are not really using that money. Would it not be better if it helped the family now, instead of later?" And the word using stung because it carried an implication that my life had already slowed to the point where my needs no longer mattered. Then Kayla smiled with that bright, almost teasing look and told me, "You read all those books about happy endings. This could be ours." And I knew she meant it as a joke, but the joke was built on the assumption that my savings existed to purchase a dream for them, not a future for me. And I sat there with a gentle ache in my shoulders, remembering every shift I worked at the library, every extra dollar I tucked away after Tom died, every choice I made to keep our household afloat. The humiliation was not loud or dramatic. It was the quiet kind that happens when someone looks at you and only sees the things they can take. And I felt small for a moment, smaller than I had in a long time. Yet I also felt something else, something more like recognition, the clarity that comes when a truth you have tried to ignore becomes too obvious to turn away from. After they left that afternoon, Daniel sent me an email that read almost like a form request, asking if I would consider adding his name to my savings account for emergencies, and he framed it as a safety measure and said it would help him help me, which might have sounded loving to someone who did not know better, but I knew exactly what it meant, and I sat at my desk looking at the message while the light faded through the blinds and finally typed back, "I would rather keep my emergency money for my actual emergencies, but thank you," and I pressed send without apologizing or softening the words because I was tired of shrinking myself. Daniel saw the message, I knew he did, but he did not reply, and that silence felt louder than any argument could have been. Later that night, I signed into my banking account and stared at the number that had taken a lifetime to build, $492,000 each dollar, representing some part of my past, every hour, every sacrifice, every moment. When I told myself I would be grateful later for the safety it offered, and I sat at the dining table with my notebook open and wrote, "Not for them, for survival." And though the words were small on the page, they felt larger in my hand, because it was the first time I wrote down something I had only whispered to myself for months. I closed the notebook slowly and sat back listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator, feeling the weight of the moment settle around me, and I realized that Daniel and Kayla did not accidentally overstep. They had a plan, and it included my house and my savings and my future, arranged neatly like items on a checklist. And no matter how polite their language sounded, the truth was unmistakable. They had begun planning their lives around what they assumed they would inherit. And the saddest part was that they did it right in front of me, as if my presence no longer complicated those plans at all. The months that followed slipped by in a slow tightening spiral, not a sudden collapse, but a steady collection of small moments that pressed against each other until they formed something sharp. And by early 2022, the tone of every conversation with Daniel and Kayla had shifted so subtly that I almost missed the transition from worry to strategy, from concern to control. And it began with little messages from Kayla sent at odd hours with links to assisted living places she described as cute and modern, written in bright, cheerful wording that felt strangely hollow when paired with pictures of tidy rooms that looked nothing like the life I had built in my own home. And sometimes She added a note saying it is never too early to plan, or the best decisions are made before a crisis, which made me wonder whether she was imagining a crisis or hoping one would justify her plans. Daniel, meanwhile, had adopted a new curiosity about my financial life, asking questions about my life insurance policy and the retirement account I had rolled over after leaving the library. His tone soft but persistent, and once he asked whether I had ever considered consolidating everything which he said was easier for families as they prepare for the future, and the word families lingered in my mind because it did not feel like he was talking about my future at all. Then came the request that pretended to be temporary the moment he called one evening with a strained voice explaining that the roof on their house needed repairs, and his credit card balance had climbed higher than expected, and he asked if he could borrow $8,000 to help cover the costs and promised he would return it in 3 months. And I remember that I hesitated only a second because a mother's instinct to help does not disappear, even when she is slowly realizing her place in her child's priorities, so I transferred the money and told him to take care of himself. 3 months became 4, then 5, then 6, and when I gently mentioned it during a casual visit, he laughed lightly and said it will all come back to me anyway when you know. And the unfinished sentence landed on the table between us like a cold stone, making me realize he had already started to treat my eventual absence as a financial timeline rather than a human reality, and I felt the sting of that comment radiate through me long after he left. At the same time, Kayla turned her attention to my banking, and one afternoon when she was helping clean up after dinner, she wandered to the kitchen counter and opened the drawer where I kept my small notebook, the one where I used to jot down simple passwords when I felt overwhelmed by the dozens of accounts life now seemed to require. And she must have tried to use an old login to access my savings, because later that week, Daniel asked in a strangely sharp tone whether I had changed my password without telling them. And when I said yes, Kayla sighed dramatically and told him in my presence, she does not trust us, which is not normal. All my clients put their kids on their accounts, and she said it with such confidence that I almost wondered whether I had missed some unwritten rule of aging, and Daniel began hinting to others that I was acting paranoid, even though all I had done was protect the only financial security I had. The comments became more pointed as the year moved on, and they would talk in front of me about older people clinging to money or how some parents make things harder by not planning ahead. And once Kayla looked directly at me and said, "It is almost like she thinks we are the enemy," and there was a strange bitterness in her tone, as if she genuinely believed that I had wronged her by not handing over the keys to my life fast enough, while all I could think was that enemies usually hide their intentions better. Still, the small humiliations accumulated quietly, piling up in a way that made the air around them feel heavier each time I visited, and the realization settled deeper that their concern was not concern, but hunger disguised as responsibility. One afternoon, I joined a few friends from the library for lunch, and Daniel insisted on helping me reserve the table, suggesting I use my credit card because it was easier, and he would pay me back later, and I smiled politely and said, "I have started using cash." Lately, my card gets nervous around people who like to forget things, and the table laughed while Daniel's face reddened slightly before he forced a grin, and though it was a small moment, I felt a flicker of satisfaction. Not because I wanted to hurt him, but because I had finally given voice to the frustration that had been growing inside me. But humor does not erase the truth, and that night as I lay in bed, the quiet of my house felt both safe and unbearably heavy, and I stared at the ceiling with the realization that had been creeping toward me slowly. The realization that Daniel and Kayla no longer saw me as a person with needs and fears and memories. They saw me as an account, a reservoir they believed would eventually flow directly into their hands, and the ache that settled in my chest was not about money, but about the loss of something I once believed was unshakable, the bond between a mother and her child. I closed my eyes and let the silence settle, and in that moment I understood that something fundamental had shifted, and that their plan, spoken and unspoken, now revolved around the assumption that my life and my assets were part of their future pathway. And though I did not yet know it, this was the beginning of the point where concern slipped fully into entitlement, and the shape of our relationship would never be the same again. The morning I fell did not begin with anything unusual, just the sharp winter air leaking through the edges of the kitchen window and the faint creak of the old radiator fighting to warm the house. And I remember thinking that January always made the hardwood seem colder under my feet, so I moved slowly as I made my way toward the bathroom, still half asleep, one hand brushing the wall the way I often did when the cold made my joints stiff. And then everything happened in a single breath when my foot slid across the corner of the small rug I had meant to remove for weeks. The floor tilted beneath me, and my hip twisted with a noise I felt more than heard, as if something deep inside had been wrenched out of place, and I landed hard on the tile with a thud that knocked the air from my lungs and sent a wave of heat, followed by a deep cold spreading through my leg. For a moment, I could not understand why my body would not obey me, and I lay there shivering as the chill from the tile soaked through my clothes, my hands trembling as I tried to reach the counter, my fingertips scraping the grout because the counter felt as far away as the edge of a cliff, and I pressed my palm against the wall trying to brace myself, but the pain in my hip pulsed so sharply that I could barely breathe. I told myself I just needed to call Daniel, that he would understand, that he would come, and with effort that made my vision blur, I pulled my phone closer by the corner of its case, the screen lighting up the floor with a pale glow as I hit his name and listened to the ringing echo into nothing, each ring pressing the hollow truth against me more firmly. And when it went to voicemail, I swallowed the panic rising in my throat and tried Kayla, telling myself she was always glued to her phone and surely she would answer. But her phone also rang and rang until the sound became unbearable. And after nearly 15 minutes, a message appeared from her saying she could not talk because they were with buyers, and asking if this was about the accounts again, which made something inside me go unbearably still. I typed back that I fell and could not stand and waited, staring at the phone, as if my son and his wife might suddenly realize what those words meant. But no reply came. No call. Nothing except the faint buzz of cold air under the bathroom door and the ache spreading down my leg. My mind flashed back suddenly to a summer afternoon when Daniel was small and tripped in the backyard, scraping his knee on the stone path. How he cried in that loud, helpless way children cry when pain terrifies them, and I had scooped him up and sat with him on the bathroom floor for almost an hour, holding him, soothing him, telling him he was safe, even though his small body shook. And remembering that moment now made the silence in my house feel like a second fall, one that hit deeper than the tile beneath me. I do not know how long I lay there before I realized that Gloria might be home after her night shift, and my hands were shaking uncontrollably as I dialed her number, because my fingers were stiff with cold and fear. And when she answered, her voice snapped awake instantly, asking what was wrong, and the moment I whispered that I could not get up, she said she was coming, and she meant it, because I heard her footsteps almost immediately, fast and determined, and keys rattling before the door swung open. She rushed to me and dropped to her knees without hesitation, covering my shoulders with a towel she must have grabbed from the hooks in my hallway, touching my arm gently but firmly to keep me from trying to move, telling me I was freezing and asking how long I had been there, and I could not answer because my teeth were chattering, so she called for help herself and kept her hand over mine the entire time we waited. When the paramedics lifted me onto the stretcher, the room spun, and I felt the cold leaving my body only to be replaced by a hollow ache so deep it felt connected to everything I had tried to ignore for months. And in the ambulance, the nurse leaned over and asked if I had any children they should contact, and I heard myself say, "One son," busy the words slipping out before I could catch them, a confession of something I had not wanted to admit fully until that moment. At the hospital, they examined me, confirmed the fracture wrapped me in warm blankets that did little to numb the quiet inside me. And when they moved me to the rehab center that afternoon, I felt as if the world around me had shrunk to the size of the thin bed they wheeled me onto. The first night in rehab, I lay awake listening to the soft hum of machines in the hallway and the occasional clatter of carts being pushed from room to room, and I kept turning my phone over in my hand, hoping it would light up with something that sounded like concern, but the only message I received came from Daniel, a single text that said he heard I was at rehab and that the fall scared them, and that we really should get control of your accounts, Mom, for everyone's safety. And I stared at the words until the letters blurred, thinking that this was what replaced compassion, that my pain had become another opportunity in their minds to argue for access. I turned my face toward the wall and felt the truth settle in a way that no longer surprised me. A truth so heavy and cold that it almost matched the tile floor from that morning. The truth that even in the moment when I needed someone most, my son had chosen the safety of my accounts over the safety of his mother, and in that realization, the dark tunnel I had entered finally showed its shape. The next afternoon, the light in my rehab room was thin and colorless, the kind that drifts through blinds without warming anything, and I heard the familiar pattern of footsteps in the hallway before Daniel and Kayla appeared in the doorway carrying a small bouquet wrapped in plastic, the price tag still stuck to the stem, as if even the flowers had been chosen without thought, and they greeted me with voices that sounded too bright, asking how I was feeling while their eyes scanned the room with the distracted air of people already thinking about something else. And we spoke about the weather and the nurses and how the food could be worse, all the small things people say when they do not want to touch what is actually happening. After only a minute or two, Daniel pulled a chair closer to the bed and sat down, slowly clearing his throat in that way he did when he was rehearsing a speech. And Kayla smoothed her hair and opened her bag, pulling out a folder with printed pages inside, and he began talking about what they had been thinking using calm tones that made me feel like a child being guided through a plan I had no role in creating. He said they had looked at the numbers and realized that selling my house now would bring in a good amount, especially with how the market was behaving. And Kayla nodded eagerly, explaining that combining the proceeds with my $500,000 in savings could create a strong foundation for the whole family, her words floating calmly in the air like they belonged to a dream she was already living in. They spoke about assisted living as if it were a gentle solution, saying that a simpler place would be safer for me and more cost-effective. And then they talked about how the remaining money could be invested for Logan's future, which they described in warm detail, painting a picture of a life where my savings provided the stepping stones their son deserved. And I felt something inside me pull tight, because the entire plan was described as if it were already decided, as if they were presenting me with an itinerary rather than a choice. Then Kayla reached into her folder and pulled out a crisp stack of papers, clipped neatly to a board, and she placed it on my lap with a bright, practiced smile, explaining that these were the forms to make Daniel a joint owner on my savings account so everything could move smoothly when the house sold. And she spoke with the confidence of a realtor, finalizing a contract, flipping through the pages to show me where to sign, as if my hesitation were only a matter of paperwork. Daniel leaned forward with that patient tone he had started using more often, the tone that disguised entitlement as logic, and told me I had lived my life and did not really spend that money, and that letting it sit there was wasteful when it could help the family now. And the words hit me with a force so sharp I felt it move through my chest, because in that sentence, he dismissed not just my savings, but my time, my years, my future, and the implication that I had reached the end of usefulness settled over me like a cold cloud. I looked at both of them, their faces expectant and confident, waiting for the easy signature they assumed would come, because they had decided the plan made sense. And in that moment, I felt the memory of the tile floor under me, the cold, creeping up my arms, the ringing of unanswered calls, and I said quietly that when I was lying on the bathroom floor, I thought about calling them again. But I did not, and that was the first decision I made about my future without them. And I watched the confusion flicker across their faces as if they could not understand how those two truths connected. They left soon after, their smiles thinner, their voices uncertain, and I lay in the quiet room staring at the ceiling while the weight of the day settled into my bones. And when the nurse came to check on me, I asked her softly if she could bring me my purse, saying I needed something from it. When she set it on my blanket, I opened it slowly, my hands trembling slightly from the heaviness of what I already knew I had to do, and I reached inside for a folder I had pushed to the bottom years ago, the one Tom, labeled in his shaky handwriting during the final months of his life, the one marked Final Estate. Inside were documents that once made sense for a family I believed would care for one another, a will that named Daniel the sole beneficiary and the holder of power of attorney, a signature from my husband written with a hand already weakened by illness, and seeing it now felt like looking at the reflection of a life that no longer existed, a life built on trust that had been quietly taken for granted. I sat with the folder on my lap for a long time, the pages heavy as if soaked in. All the years I thought I understood my place in my own family, and then I pulled out a blank piece of paper from the pocket inside the folder and wrote a single sentence in my neat, steady handwriting. The sentence that had risen again and again in my mind. Since the morning of the fall, I changed my mind the day my son did not answer the phone, and I placed that page in the front of the folder where it whispered the truth, even if it held no legal power. After a long breath, I picked up my phone and dialed the number of Mark Ellison, the attorney who had helped me settle the small details after Tom passed, and when he answered, I told him that I was ready to talk about a trust and that I was no longer interested in making my son more comfortable. I was interested in being safe. And the tremor in my voice faded as soon as I said it, because I realized that this was the moment. The ground shifted, the moment the quiet inside me turned into a firm and steady no, and I understood with a clarity that reached down into the deepest part of me that this was the beginning of something I should have done long ago. Mark arrived 2 mornings later, walking into my rehab room with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen far too many families crumble under the weight of money and expectation, and he set his laptop on the small rolling table while greeting me with a warmth that felt startling after the week I had endured. Then he pulled up a chair and asked gently if I was ready to begin, and when I nodded, he paused before opening his files and looked at me with an expression that suggested he needed one more piece of truth before we moved forward. He asked if your son had come when you called. Would we be having this conversation? And the room seemed to shift slightly as I let the question settle, because the answer rose so quickly, it surprised me. And I said, probably not realizing then how much of my decision was rooted in the moment I finally understood where I stood in Daniel's life. And Mark nodded slowly before saying, "This is not about punishment, it is about truth." And the steadiness of his voice made something in me relax for the first time since the fall. He opened a new document on his screen and began outlining what the irrevocable living trust would include, explaining each step carefully, while glancing at me to make sure I understood, and I listened without interrupting, because every word felt like a new foundation being poured under my feet. He said we would place the house into the trust, the place I had built with Tom and kept alive for decades, and we would move the full $500,000 of my savings into it as well. And once it was in the trust, it would no longer be vulnerable to anyone's pressure or persuasion, which felt like a kind of protection I had not known how to ask for before. Then he described the beneficiaries and asked whether the percentages he drafted matched my wishes. And when he read them aloud, I felt a strange mix of sadness and clarity, because the list reflected a life I had lived with, intention, not a life I was handing over out of obligation. 10% would go to the reading fund at the elementary school where I had spent 30 years guiding small hands through pages of stories, 10% to a local literacy program that worked with adults who had never been given the chance to read with confidence, and 80% would go to Gloria Reed, the woman who showed up when my own family did not, the one who held my hand on the cold tile as if I were someone who mattered. The numbers looked almost surreal on paper, yet deeply right, and I felt a strange weight lift from my chest when Mark looked up and asked whether I wanted anything changed. I told him no. This was the first choice I had made in a long time that felt like it belonged entirely to me. Then he leaned back slightly and said, there was one more step. He recommended something important if I wanted real autonomy, and he suggested we revoke all previous powers of attorney that had ever been given to Daniel, explaining that leaving them active created roots of influence and argument that could undermine the trust later. And he added a clause stating that any family member who attempted to contest the trust would lose all rights to any small gifts included elsewhere. His voice was calm but firm as he walked me through the legal effect of each line, and the more he explained, the more I felt myself stepping into a space of quiet strength, a space I had not occupied since long before Tom passed. He showed me charts detailing how a trust could not be used as collateral, how it prevented forced sales, how it insulated the money from anyone who believed they had automatic claim to it. And he described it all with a level of precision that made me realize how deeply vulnerable I had been before this moment, how exposed my financial life had remained, while I clung to the idea that Daniel would someday choose compassion over convenience. When we finished drafting the documents, Mark asked if I wanted him to communicate anything to my son, something small to set a boundary without alarming him, and I hesitated before deciding that a subtle gesture might carry more weight than a confrontation. So I asked if he could send a polite email confirming that I was handling my own estate planning and that all financial matters were secure and under my sole control, something simple and professional that would make Daniel understand the shift without giving him the chance to argue. Mark typed the message in front of me, read it aloud to ensure the tone was neutral, and sent it with the same calm efficiency he had shown throughout the meeting. Then he packed his laptop and said he would return with final papers the next day. After he left the room, felt strangely lighter. The faint scent of antiseptic no longer as sharp, and I lay back against the thin pillow listening to the quiet hum of the hallway when my phone buzzed from the small table near the bed. I did not reach for it immediately because I already knew what name would appear, and when I finally picked it up, I saw Daniel had called twice and left a voicemail, the message icon glowing like a small, flashing reminder of the world I had just stepped away from. I pressed play and listened to his voice spill through the speaker, sounding strangely tight as he asked why an attorney was emailing him about my finances and whether something was going on that he should know about. And though his words were framed with concern, the edge beneath them revealed the panic of someone who feared a door had closed. I let the message run out without replying, letting his voice echo softly through the room, and for the first time in a long time, I smiled. Not out of bitterness, but out of the small, quiet triumph of finally choosing myself. As I set the phone down, I understood that something irreversible had happened, that my savings and my home were finally beyond the reach of Daniel and Kayla's plans, and the justice in that realization was not loud or vengeful. It was quiet and steady, like a door locking gently behind me, sealing away the parts of my life they had treated like stepping stones for their own ambitions. Going home felt strange at first, as if I were stepping back into a version of my life that no longer fit quite the same way. And when Gloria pulled up in front of my house with the back seat filled with my small suitcase and 2 paper bags of groceries she insisted on buying, I felt both grateful and unsteady, leaning on the walker as the cold air brushed against my face, and the familiar outline of the porch came into view. The chipped paint on the railing, oddly comforting after weeks of hospital lights and antiseptic smells. Gloria carried everything inside with her usual quiet strength, moving with the speed of someone who has spent her life helping without waiting to be asked, and she propped the front door open with her hip as she said, "Welcome home," with a smile that felt steadier than the floor beneath my feet. Then she helped me inside and waited until I lowered myself into the old armchair in the living room, the one that had molded to my body through years of late-night reading. For a moment, we just breathed in the stillness together, the kind of silence that comes from a house waiting patiently for someone to return, and then she started unpacking groceries in the kitchen while I sat collecting myself. Feeling the weight of everything I had chosen these past weeks settle into the rooms around me. Later that afternoon, after Gloria left to get some rest before her night shift, I reached for the iPad Daniel used to set up for me, glancing at the familiar icons that seemed suddenly intrusive. Now that I understood how easily he had slipped into parts of my life, I should have guarded more closely, and I pressed the settings button with a small surge of determination. Resetting the Wi-Fi was almost embarrassingly simple, changing the password even easier. And I moved through each screen, removing remote access, unlinking devices, clearing old backups, and when I finished, I sat back, feeling an unexpected lightness, as if I had closed a door. He did not realize he no longer had permission to enter. When Gloria came by the next morning and asked why the network name had changed, I told her with a grin that I changed the locks just digitally first. And she laughed so hard she had to lean against the counter, the kind of laughter that makes the whole kitchen warmer. Not long after I tackled another piece of unfinished business, something I had ignored for too long out of habit rather than choice, and I called my insurance company to tell them I needed to remove Daniel's use of my address for his car insurance because he did not live with me and I did not want my information tied to his policies anymore, and the representative handled it quickly, sending confirmation to both me and Daniel. He called that evening with a sharp edge in his voice, asking why his rate had suddenly increased and why I had made changes without talking to him first. And I said calmly, "If you do not live here, you should not profit from it." Letting the words hang in the air until he had nothing left to say, and after a long silence, he hung up without a goodbye. I knew that conversation was only a small shift in a much larger divide, but it felt good in a quiet way, like dusting off a shelf that had been ignored for far too long. A few days later, the most unsettling twist arrived from someone I had never met, a loan officer from a local bank, who called politely asking if I could confirm information from Daniel's mortgage pre-approval application, because there seemed to be a discrepancy regarding expected assets, and when she read the line aloud saying he anticipated receiving 50% of his mother's home within 2 years, I felt a cold breath move through me, not sharp like the fall, but dull and heavy, like a bruise being pressed. I told her there would be no such inheritance for him to use that way, my voice steady even as something inside me sagged under the truth of how early and how confidently he had planned my absence, and she apologized before ending the call, leaving me sitting alone in my kitchen with the soft hum of the refrigerator, the only sound in the house. I walked slowly to the back door after that, pushing it open with the edge of my hand, and stepped onto the small patio where the winter wind brushed against the dry grass, the lawn brown and thirsty from months without care. And for a moment, the weight of it all pressed against my shoulders, the betrayal, the entitlement, the quiet realization that my son had already mapped out my place in his future without asking if I had one of my own. But then I picked up the hose, turning the nozzle until water flowed in a soft, steady stream, and I began watering the brittle patches of grass, one small circle at a time, because tending to something that belonged to me felt like reclaiming space I had allowed to shrink with each concession. And as I moved slowly across the yard, I felt a strange combination of sorrow and relief, an ache for what had been lost, and a small, budding peace for what I was taking back inch by inch. In the days that followed, I continued that quiet process of retrieval, not in dramatic sweeps, but in small, deliberate acts, opening windows that had stayed shut too long, dusting picture frames, tightening loose hinges, and each motion felt like a sentence in a new chapter I was writing for myself, one that existed outside the shadow of Daniel and Kayla's expectations. I made tea in the evenings and sat by the window watching the neighborhood settle into dusk. And though the loneliness pulsed, sometimes it did not sting the way it once had, because the house finally felt like it belonged to me again. Not as a future asset in someone else's plans, but as a living space, shaped by my choices. It was not loud revenge, not even dramatic, but it was sharp in its own quiet way, each small boundary a line drawn clearly, each refusal a soft correction of the life they had tried to draft for me, and as the days passed, I realized that these silent shifts, these small reclaimings, were the first real victories in a story that was no longer about surviving betrayal, but about becoming whole again. The confrontation came on a Sunday afternoon when the air outside felt damp and undecided, and I had just sat down with a cup of tea when the knock at the door came sharp and urgent in a way that made my stomach tighten, because I already knew it would not be a neighbor or a delivery. It would be Daniel and Kayla arriving with the kind of determination that had nothing to do with love. When I opened the door, they were standing there not alone, but flanked by Kayla's mother Linda and her close friend Becky, and the sight of them lined up on my porch made something inside me settle into a wary stillness because it felt less like a visit and more like a tribunal stepping into place. They filed into my living room with too much familiarity, carrying tote bags and folders, and Kayla announced brightly that they were here for a loving intervention, words that floated in the air with a sweetness that felt artificial, like perfume sprayed to cover something rotten underneath. They arranged themselves around my coffee table, clearing the space as if preparing a conference, and Kayla pulled out a stack of brochures for assisted living facilities, spreading them neatly across the wooden surface beside a printed spreadsheet labeled Mom's Assets, which held bold lines dividing the value of my home and the $500,000 in savings they believed were theirs to manage. And I sat down slowly in my armchair while they all hovered with the energy of people about to deliver practice speeches. Kayla began presenting as if she were hosting a seminar, pointing to the glossy images of Shady Oaks and explaining line by line that if we move you here, the monthly cost will be this amount, and that will leave this much from your savings, and combined with selling this house. Daniel and I will be able to secure Logan's college fund and finally upgrade to the home we have been planning, for her voice smooth and rehearsed as she flipped between pages with the confidence of a real estate agent listing a property rather than a daughter-in-law speaking to the woman whose life they were rearranging on paper. Daniel nodded along with an expression of patient authority, adding that this was not just about them. It was about not wasting what Dad left and about responsible planning. And he said, right now, your money is just sitting there with a tone that suggested that my existence was inefficient, that the resources I spent a lifetime building needed to be put to work for someone other than me. Linda leaned forward and tapped the spreadsheet with one manicured finger, adding that her daughter and Daniel were simply being responsible, and that I should be grateful they were thinking ahead, as if gratitude were the appropriate response to being treated like a financial obstacle, standing between them and their imagined future. Becky nodded with sympathy that felt strangely rehearsed, her eyes sliding across me the way someone might look at a document needing approval, and everything in the room seemed to close in on itself while they continued to explain their plan with the confidence of people who believed the ending was already set. Their voices rose and fell like a scripted presentation, full of phrases designed to sound caring, but built entirely around the assumption that I would fold, that I would sign, that I would hand my life over to their agenda. And for a moment, I simply listened the calm before a kind of quiet storm building deep inside me. Then, when Kayla placed a pen beside the stack of papers with a small, satisfied smile, I stood up slowly, using the arm of the chair for balance, and their voices faltered just enough for me to feel the shift in the room, a ripple of uncertainty threading through their confidence. I walked to the drawer of my side table, the one Daniel always pretended not to notice but always mentally inventoried, and I reached inside to pull out the folder that had waited there like a sealed truth. The folder marked Final Estate in Tom's fading handwriting, and I carried it to the coffee table with a steadiness that made them all straighten in their seats. I placed the folder down, opened it carefully, and lifted the trust papers. Mark and I had finalized the pages crisp and unmistakably official. Then I began reading aloud in a clear, steady voice, naming each detail: the transfer of the house into an irrevocable trust, the full $500,000 in savings that no longer belonged to any bank account they could touch, the revocation of all powers of attorney previously held by Daniel, the clauses that prevented any family member from contesting the trust without forfeiting all remaining rights, and finally the list of beneficiaries: 10% to the elementary school reading fund, 10% to the literacy program, 80% to Gloria Reed. The room went silent in a way that made the ticking of the clock on the wall sound like a hammer strike, and I watched as Kayla's face drained of color, her lips parting in disbelief as she stared at the papers as if trying to understand a language she had never learned. Linda blinked rapidly, her eyes wide with confusion and outrage, and she finally managed to say, "You gave your house and $500,000 to a neighbor," her voice rising as if the absurdity were too much to contain. And even Becky, who had positioned herself confidently beside Kayla, leaned back in her seat with her mouth slightly open. Gloria, sitting quietly at the edge of the room where I had invited her just to have a witness without telling her why, looked stunned, her eyes filling not with greed but with a mix of shock and something soft, something painfully close to gratitude, because she had never expected anything like this, never asked for anything, never assumed she had a place in any future of mine except the next day she showed up. I looked at all of them in turn, letting the silence stretch until it felt like a taut line. Then I said in a calm voice that carried more strength than I expected, that toxic family is not just shouting or slamming doors. It is what you did when I was lying on the floor calling for help. It is the silence that answered me. It is the way you planned my future without asking if I was still in it. And Gloria came because she saw me as a person, not a financial plan. So yes, this is my family betrayal story, and this is how I write its ending. The room remained frozen, the brochures still scattered across the table like relics of a plan already dead. And as the weight of my words settled over them, I saw the final truth in their eyes, the moment they realized that their financial intervention had backfired so completely that nothing in their imagined future could be salvaged from the wreckage. After the meeting, the air in my house had barely settled before the ripples of its consequences began spreading into their lives, and within a week, Daniel and Kayla started running into walls they had never imagined would appear, because every plan they had built, every mortgage pre-approval they chased, every calculation they had crafted around my supposed inheritance, suddenly collapsed when the bank flagged their application and rejected it on the grounds that their expected support was no longer verifiable, a phrase that Daniel repeated over the phone to Kayla with disbelief, as if the world itself had betrayed him, instead of the truth simply catching up. Their finances began tightening around them like a belt pulled one notch too far, the car payment looming, Logan's after-school program, fees coming due, the credit card balance climbing, because Kayla's commissions had slowed during a sluggish season, and for the first time I heard from neighbors that Kayla had begun showing houses with a smile that looked painted on, strained and cracking at the edges, whenever a client asked if the market was making her nervous. The escalated twist arrived when Daniel, refusing to accept defeat, attempted to tell the loan officer that he was still my primary beneficiary, insisting that nothing had changed and that he simply did not have the documents on hand. But the officer calmly responded that they would need to see the actual estate paperwork and that without it, his claim could not be accepted. And in that moment, the lie he had leaned on for years evaporated in front of him, leaving him exposed and furious at a system that was finally indifferent to him. A few days later, on a gray afternoon with rain sliding down my windows like thin silver threads, I heard another knock on my door, softer than before, almost hesitant, and when I opened it, Daniel and Kayla stood there looking worn, as if they had aged in the span of a week. Dark circles under their eyes, shoulders slumped lips, pressed into thin lines that tried and failed to hold dignity. Daniel spoke first, rubbing the back of his neck like a boy caught doing something wrong, telling me that I had made my point and that they were here to ask me to reconsider, maybe change the trust, so that at least Logan would get something someday. His voice cracking. Not with humility, but with the exhaustion of a man who realized the lifeline he expected was no longer dangling in front of him. Kayla stepped forward with tears already glistening, her voice trembling as she said, "We are drowning Mara. This feels like punishment," and she reached out a hand as if trying to bridge a distance that she herself had created with every careless word. Every moment she reduced me to a bank account rather than a mother-in-law who once held hope for their bond. I let the rain-filled silence stretch between us before answering, not raising my voice or hardening it, but letting the truth fall gently and firmly when I said that I had begged for help on a cold tile floor, while pain crawled through my bones and fear sat in my throat, and that was punishment. That was abandonment. That was the moment I understood exactly what I meant to them. And this trust, this decision is not punishment, it is protection. It is the line between who I was and who I must be now. Daniel tried again, muttering that people make mistakes and that families should work through things, but I shook my head, explaining that an irrevocable trust is not a toy to be picked up and put down, depending on his convenience that it exists to shield me from manipulation, and that even if I wanted to change it, the structure itself would not allow that without layers of legal intervention he could never force me through. Kayla sobbed harder, pressing her hands to her face, while Daniel paced my small porch, as if searching for an argument strong enough to break through solid stone. And when neither of them spoke for a moment, I sensed the shift the moment the audacity they had carried for years returned in a final attempt to salvage something. He finally said that at least Logan should be allowed to spend time in the house he would one day inherit, trying to sound reasonable, trying to wrap entitlement in the soft blanket of family, and I felt a profound stillness settle inside me before I replied that Logan was welcome in my home as my grandson, that I would gladly cook for him, read to him, laugh with him, but he would not be welcomed here as a future heir to something that was not and would never be his, because love and inheritance were not the same currency, and I refused to let them teach him otherwise. The words hung in the damp air, and I watched the realization click into place behind their tired eyes, the final twist revealing itself in their posture when they understood that the financial door they had pushed at for years was now sealed shut, welded by their own neglect and greed, and no amount of pleading or guilt or carefully phrased appeals could pry it open. Kayla wiped her cheeks and looked at Daniel for guidance, but he had none to give, and after a long moment he simply nodded a gesture that contained both resignation and a flicker of shame, and they turned to leave, walking slowly back to their car while the rain softened around them like a curtain falling at the end of a play. I closed the door gently, not triumphant or vindictive, but grounded in the certainty that protecting myself had been the only path left, and somewhere deep inside me, a small, quiet part straightened its spine, knowing that for the first time in years, I had chosen truth over fear, boundaries over longing and dignity, over the history that once tied us together, but no longer held weight. In the weeks that followed their visit, My house settled into a quiet rhythm that felt like breathing after holding my lungs tight for too long. And as winter loosened its grip, I found myself moving through the rooms with a steadiness that surprised even me, no longer needing the walker that once felt like an extension of my fear, only carrying a simple cane when I stepped outside more for confidence than necessity. And each morning I woke with a little more strength in my legs and a little less weight on my chest. Gloria remained my constant presence, not hovering, not inserting herself into every corner of my life, but drifting in with groceries when she came off her shift or sitting with me on the porch when the air was warm enough to pretend spring had already arrived, and our companionship unfolded in a way that felt natural and balanced, like two women who had chosen each other instead of leaning out of desperation. And that difference alone felt like a kind of healing. One quiet afternoon, after tidying the living room and dusting the window frames, I opened the drawer where the final folder rested, the same folder that once felt heavy enough to tilt the axis of my life, and I placed it on the kitchen table, smoothing the worn manila cover with my fingers, as if tracing a scar that no longer hurt. I opened it slowly, page by careful page, reviewing each document not with fear or urgency, but with a calm acceptance that everything inside reflected choices I had made from a place of truth, not panic. And when I reached the very back, I slipped out a small envelope I had added weeks earlier, a letter addressed not to Daniel, not to the attorney or the trust or anyone outside of myself, but to me. Written on simple lined paper in handwriting I recognized from decades of to-do lists and birthday cards and library memos. I unfolded it and read the words I had written on a night when everything felt fragile. You chose truth over appearances. You chose safety over fear. That is not hate. That is survival. And as I read it again, I felt something in me settle, as if the woman who wrote that letter and the woman reading it had finally become the same person. I tucked the letter back into the folder and closed it gently, no longer feeling it as a shield I had to hold up every day, but as a reminder of the moment I stopped letting other people define what my life should look like. And when I returned it to the drawer, I felt an unexpected softness in my chest, a quiet justice that needed no applause. Outside, the weather warmed, and I began tending to the neglected flower beds along my front porch, kneeling in the dirt with a satisfaction I had not felt in years as I pulled weeds, softened soil, and replanted small bursts of color that would bloom through spring and summer. And one afternoon I hammered a small wooden sign into the freshly mulched corner near the steps, painting the words, "Reading Corner," in simple blue strokes, a tribute to the decades I spent surrounded by children and books and stories that taught me hope. When the neighborhood kids began lingering near the fence after school, watching me water the flowers, I invited them over one by one, and soon it became routine for 3 or 4 of them to sit cross-legged on my porch each evening, while I read aloud from the old favorites I had kept from the library clearance sales, and their laughter and questions filled the air in a way that made my home feel like a home again, instead of an estate someone else was waiting to liquidate. Daniel and Kayla stayed on the edges of my life, sending the occasional polite message updates about Logan's school project or a holiday greeting typed too formally to feel warm. And though I answered kindly, I did not stretch the conversations beyond what they offered, not because I held anger, but because the boundary had become a natural part of how I protected myself, a gentle yet firm line that did not need to be defended every minute. They never asked about the trust again, never mentioned the house or the savings, never implied that anything should return to the way it used to be. And in that absence of entitlement, I found a surprising amount of peace. The relationship cool, but clear, distant, but honest, something livable even if it would never be what it once was. One late afternoon, as the sun settled low and gold over the dining table, I sat with a cup of tea and watched the amber light fall across the wood, turning everything warm and soft, and I reached into the drawer one last time to place the final folder inside, aligning it neatly with the edge, as if marking the end of a chapter, not with bitterness, but with acceptance. The folder no longer felt like armor, no longer a weight or a weapon, but a symbol of a decision that redirected the course of my life towards something steadier and safer. And closing, the drawer felt like closing the last door on a betrayal that had once overshadowed everything. In that moment, a quiet voice in my mind narrated words that wrapped themselves around the stillness of the room, a reminder to myself, and maybe to anyone who has ever loved too hard or trusted too long, that in a world built on silent revenge, real justice does not always look like shouting. Sometimes it is simply a woman standing up for herself, choosing dignity over money, choosing truth over fear, and closing the folder on a betrayal that finally reached its end.